I thought I had it on. There we go. All right. Matthew 24. We are going to be camping out probably for the next 6 weeks in Matthew 24. I'm just telling you. Because there's an awful lot that's there. I hear that amen. And if, as we go through, what we're going to see is that so much of the rest of the prophetic books attaches itself to Matthew 24. If you can visualize one of those ancestry charts. Thank you. Matthew 24 is at the top, and then everything else springs off of that. We'll have the major minor prophets, we'll have the Gospels, we'll have the epistles, we'll have Revelation, and all of those things contribute to the discussion of Matthew 24 and 25, familiarly known as the Sermon on the Mount. Would you grab me a bottle of water, please? So, Matthew 24 and 25 is commonly called the Olivet Discourse, named that way because it was delivered by Jesus to the disciples on the Mount of Olives, overlooking Jerusalem and the temple complex. And the theme of this discussion that Jesus has with his disciples is his second coming at the end of the present age to establish his kingdom, millennial kingdom on the earth. And this is the largest and most detailed discussion that Jesus has with anybody in all of the Gospels. So we begin. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Now, you have to keep in mind a little bit of the backstory here, and I would encourage you in the weeks to come to start reading in Matthew 21 and then read through 25, 26 to get the full context of what's going on here. Jesus has just finished sparring with the Pharisees. And he has basically told them that they're nothing but a bunch of filthy liars and that they're a bunch of hypocrites. And he has told them that they're going to face a whole bunch of nasty judgments and all that kind of stuff. And now, after he's had this verbal altercation with them, he and the disciples are leaving the area. And in leaving the area, this discussion happens. They're walking past the temple. The disciples point out the buildings of the temple. And take that up to Russ. Take that up to Russ. Thanks. You have to keep in mind, these disciples are It's the disciples are in Jerusalem. It's kind of like country mouse, city mouse. You grow up in the middle of nowhere, Galilee, Nazareth, and now all of a sudden you're in the big city. It's kind of like walking downtown Chicago and looking up. Oh, and you get a kink in your neck once you see the 102nd story on the Sears Tower. So here they are, and the disciples, for now we'll call them Bubba. Bubba is oohing and aahing about the big city. And the most beautiful building in the city is the temple. And so they're pointing at us all out. Hey, Jesus, look at that there big building. Don't you think that, man, that's pretty fancy. Wow, that's the temple. Okay? And then Jesus answers, you see all these, do you not? Meaning all of the temple complex. And again, this is Herod's temple. And this is very beautiful, very ornate. So Jesus says, truly I say to you, there's not going to be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now, you think that comment just kind of took them by surprise? Made them gasp a little bit? So they walk out of the city, they go up and they sit on the hill, and Jesus begins to teach. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, verse 3, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when is this going to happen? When will these things be? What's going to be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you are not alarmed for this. You are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains. And we'll stop there for today. We have to understand the prophetic expectations of these disciples and of anyone steeped in Judaism. In order to truly understand the disciples' question, this is more than just a trivia question that they're asking. This is more than asking, do you think it's going to rain tomorrow? Or something like that. This is a deep-based question. And for us to really grasp the intent of what they're asking, we have to know some of the basic hopes and aspirations of Judaism in that day and era. They were tired of being under the domination of pagan oppressors. They were eagerly waiting for the promised deliverance by the Messiah that they had read about from the Old Testament writings. The northern 10 tribes of Israel had been conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and the southern 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin fell to Babylon in 586 BC. And then after that, the whole area got stomped on by the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and now the Romans. So although the majority of them are not associated with the militant zealots, they all would do a happy dance if the Romans were suddenly overthrown and Israel was to become a free nation again. They knew intimately many of the Old Testament promises of future blessings, promises of deliverance and prosperity. They knew that God had promised to vanquish all of the enemies of his chosen people, and that God had promised to establish an eternal kingdom of righteousness and justice on earth. They also knew that the Lord's anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ, would come and would establish the rule and the reign of David again on the earth. That which was supposed to be predicted as a reign of peace and prosperity and safety, and that would never end. This is the thing that they're looking forward to. This is that great longing to see that day unfold when God restored the kingdom as He had promised. So by the time of Jesus, the Jews had formed an opinion in their minds, a very clear scenario of how they believed all of these predicted events are going to unfold. And to understand what their expectations are, it would be good to read literature from that time. You see, one of the things that's important for us to do when we are studying time and place is not only to read Scripture, but also to read some of the historical documents that exist from that time and place. And there are a number of things that go into this. Some of the writings of the intertestamental books, the apocryphal books, lend themselves toward a historical narrative of this time and others. And we're not going to get into all of that because it's just too deep and you really won't care about it. I'll go, this is great, but you won't care, okay? So we're not going to get into all that. But let me give you some reasonings here as to why they have this mindset. First of all, they had read the teachings of Zechariah. And in Zechariah 14, as well as other Old Testament prophets, they believed from what was written there that the coming of Messiah would be preceded by a time of terrible tribulation. Just as a woman experiences intense pain shortly before delivering a child, so Israel would experience great torment shortly before Messiah arrives. That's the example that is used. Secondly, the popular end times teaching of Jesus' day believed that in the midst of that turmoil, there was going to appear an Elijah-like forerunner heralding the Messiah's coming. Now, this is why, you remember, the people asked John the Baptist, "Who are you? Are you Elijah? Or some other prophet?" And he said, "No, but I'm the one that the prophet spoke about, saying, get ready for the day of the Lord," okay? But they had all read that, and they knew that one like Elijah had been predicted. And so it's for that reason that they're drawn to John the Baptist. Jewish tradition maintained that ownership of any disputed property or money had to wait until Elijah comes before the debts being finally settled. That was part of it. So some of those beliefs had to do with the almighty dollar and the effect on currency. There's another thing, and that has to do with the appearance of the Messiah when he would establish his kingdom and vindicate his people. Then there would be an alliance of the nations that would come and fight against the Messiah. We read about that a lot, especially in Ezekiel, where we read about Gog and Magog and Meshach and Tubal and all of those different things, and all of these predictions that are there. Also, what was predicted was the restoring of Jerusalem, either by renovating the existing city or by rebuilding the city with a new city coming down out of heaven. There was also the teaching that the Jews would be scattered throughout the world and they would be regathered back to Israel. Well, that in essence had happened, of course, after Cyrus had given permission for the Jews to go back and to rebuild Jerusalem. Also, there was the prophetic prediction that Messiah's coming would make the area of Palestine, now don't think Palestine by today's terms, think Palestine in biblical terms, okay? That area would become the center of the world, and that nations would come and be subject to the Lord during that time. And then finally, they believed that with the establishment of Messiah's coming and rebuilding of Jerusalem and this kingdom is going to come about a new age of peace and righteousness and glory. Now these are brought about from Old Testament teachings, and so much of that corresponds to what the New Testament also teaches with regards to the second coming of Jesus. The major difference is that those Jews of Jesus' day had no knowledge that he was going to come twice. They had no knowledge of that. The first time to offer himself as a sacrifice for the world's sin, the second time to establish his kingdom on earth. The Jewish people were not looking for inward deliverance. They weren't looking to be saved as we would think of it. They were looking for outward deliverance. They were looking for political salvation. And in the minds of the Jews of Jesus' day, the time is ripe for the coming of this political Messiah. They had suffered the persecution. They had suffered the subjugation for hundreds of years. And here they are under the power of Rome. And so when John the Baptist comes on the scene, reminiscent of an Elijah-like style, okay, because John was kind of out there in your face, just like Elijah was, the people's interest is really raised. And when Jesus begins his preaching ministry with authority the way he did, and with healing of diseases, many of the Jews were convinced that he was the Messiah, a political Messiah. And so when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a colt, as predicted by the Old Testament prophets, people went nuts. And they were beside themselves with anticipation. They openly hailed him as the Messiah, the long-awaited Son of David, right? Hosanna! Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna! Which means what? Anyone? Thank you. Save us now. Okay? Think about it. It's not like we think of Hosanna, Hosanna. It was more like Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna. It's like, save us now. Save us now. Storming the gates of the White House kind of a thing. All right? That's the idea. Don't think Palm Sunday is just so cute. Oh, we'll have the kids walk up and they'll have little palm branches. Hosanna, Hosanna to the King. No, that's not what it was. Okay? It was a big, hairy deal. So Jesus comes into town. He's fulfilled all of these things in the minds of these Jewish people, and that's when the wheels begin to fall off the bus. Or off the cart. I should keep it in context, right? Okay. This is where Jesus' ministry rapidly and radically departs from the expectations of the people. According to their thinking, the next step is going to be the gathering of the nations against Messiah and his dramatic and effortless victory over them, and then they're going to crown him king. And that apparently is the mindset that is still in the minds of the disciples when they ask Jesus this question. When's this all going to happen? And in asking that, they're not thinking necessarily years down the road. They're thinking in a couple of days, maybe next week. That soon. It did not register with them. The many predictions that Jesus had to suffer, that he had to die, that he had to be resurrected, that didn't even cross their minds at this point in time. In some way or another, they had discounted those teachings, or they had rationalized something that's not going to happen. Yes. Right. It's coming. It's coming this quick. Do you think he's going to pick me to be the Secretary of State? Is it going to be me? Who's going to be this or that or the other thing? Who's going to be dog catcher? Whatever. So they have this prophetic discussion with Jesus now. And in fairness to the disciples, we have to be fair to the disciples. The Old Testament prophets that they knew, that they had read as kids growing up, going to Mishnah, going to rabbinical school, that the prophets also saw Messiah coming, Messiah establishing his kingdom. They saw this as one event. One event. The whole concept of what you and I today understand as the New Testament church was unknown to them. Was unknown to them. The church age was a mystery to them. If you look on the chart that I gave you last week, you'll see in that chart there's a line that goes along, and then there's kind of a little hiccup in the middle of that line where there's kind of like a little parenthesis in there, and it says the church age. That's us. That's where we are right now in the prophetic scheme of what is going on in God's time frame. Now, the Old Testament prophets had no clue about this. Remember, when Paul wrote to the Ephesians, he mentions to them about the church, and he said this was a mystery which formerly had been hidden, meaning Old Testament, but now is revealed to you, that being the church. It was something that the Old Testament prophets did not know about. Because Israel had experienced all kinds of difficulty, all kinds of tribulation, because Jesus had declared himself to be the Messiah, because Jesus had identified John the Baptist as his forerunner, because he had accepted the messianic acclaim of the people a few days earlier. The disciples understandably thought that the next thing would continue as it was expected. They were certain that his next move is going to be, Jesus is going to have power and whoop this confederacy of nations that's coming against him, and then he's going to step into the palace and be the king. Like that. So Jesus has spent all day Wednesday of Passover week. He is in the temple. He gives his last public teaching. He pronounces his most intense final judgment on the leaders of Israel. And now he's going to the Mount of Olives to be alone with the disciples. And here they are. And they're leaving Jerusalem. And they come to the temple. And interestingly enough, this is the only discourse of Jesus that is mentioned in all three of the synoptic gospels. Okay? So you find the Olivet discourse not only here in Matthew, but also in Mark and Luke. And the synoptics report that they were pointing to the temple in admiration. Teacher, look at these wonderful stones. What a building! And it must have been awe-inspiring. It really must have. The temple and all of the temple buildings stood on a mountain. There was a massive retaining wall on the sides to support it all. And my goodness, to a group of country bumpkins like the disciples to come and to see this kind of enormous structure was magnificent. Some of these stones measured 40 feet by 12 feet by 12 feet, weighed in excess of 100 tons. Quarried as a single piece of stone, transported many miles to the building site. Okay, so for that day, it was an unbelievable accomplishment. And the disciples are perhaps now wondering how such an amazing structure, especially one like this that is dedicated to the glory of God, how could this be left desolate as Jesus had just predicted? Because isn't that what Jesus says to them? Look at chapter 23, verse 37. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophet and disowns those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Now look at it. See, your house, it's a reference to the temple, your house is left desolate. Now these disciples are saying, when is this going to happen? Here we are. Don't you see how huge this building is? And how much effort it took and how much labor, and when's this going to really happen? What they should have remembered from all of their Old Testament teaching is they should have remembered what Ezekiel said about God's glory departing from the temple. The sanctuary that had once been the holy place, God's house, is there no longer. It is now your house, Jesus says to an unbelieving group of Jews before he leaves. And he says, your house, not my Father's house. Now it's your house. Is going to be left to you desolate. Why? Because the glory of the Lord would soon depart from it. And those buildings that had been devoted and that should have honored Jesus are going to be destroyed. So he responds to the disciples' comments by saying, yeah, you see all these things? There isn't going to be one stone left on another. And their jaws must have just gone slack when they heard Jesus say such a thing. Could not imagine how the temple could be destroyed or why God would allow such a thing to happen. But that's exactly what God did allow to happen not more than 40 years later. AD 70, the Romans came in, Titus Vespasius, and massacred most of the citizens simply because he was mad that he got beat by the Egyptians. So on his way back home, he decided he would stomp on the Jews, just to, kind of like throwing rocks through a window when you're mad about something. He decides this is what he's going to do. And in the process, he sets fire to the temple and he destroys it. He razes it to the ground, just like Jesus predicted. And the only stones that were left intact were the huge foundation stones that really weren't part of the temple proper. It was just part of the foundation. Josephus, who was a historian of the day, said that a person who visited the site after the destruction could not believe that anyone had ever inhabited the place, much less that the most magnificent structures of the ancient world had stood there only a short while before. It was that devastated. Now, the disciples are shocked to realize that the temple is going to be destroyed. They are thinking, wow, this is going to happen. Well, that has to be part of the purification by the Messiah of Jerusalem, which is probably going to take place right after he's destroyed the nations. So then they get up on the Temple Mount. In verse 3, they go through the eastern gate. It's a funny thing about the eastern gate. If you were to go to Jerusalem today and go to the Temple Mount, you know what you'll find? The eastern gate is all blocked up. It's all blocked up. The Muslims have closed the eastern gate. You know why? So that Messiah can't come back. Because the Bible says that when he comes back, he will set foot upon the Mount of Olives and he will come back into the area through the eastern gate. Well, So they go through this gate, they cross the Kidron Valley, they go up the Mount of Olives, the sun is setting, the temple is gleaming in the setting of the sunlight, and they're asking Jesus, when is this going to happen? What is going to be the sign of your coming? What's going to be the sign of the end of the age? Those are the three questions that Jesus answers in the rest of the Olivet Discourse. For some time, they had been convinced that this is going to happen immediately. So in their mind, the word when implies immediacy. It's not a long-range thing. It's like when, like maybe tomorrow or a couple hours from now, or maybe at the latest next week. The time might be that soon, maybe at the end of Passover. And these things when are these things? These things refers to what Jesus has been talking about. Namely, that the house of God is going to be left desolate, it's going to be destroyed, and the disciples are expecting this final stage of the work of Messiah is going to unfold rather quickly. Yes, the nations are going to rise against him. He's going to defeat them, nothing to it, purify Jerusalem, regather the Jews from all around the world, and have a party. What is going to be the sign of your coming? They want to know this. What would be the first indicator? How are we going to know when these last few events are going to happen? They still think of Messiah as coming, as being one event. They don't have any comprehension of the church age. And they don't have any idea that there's going to be a period of time between his two comings. And they probably thought that the sign of his coming would be something spectacular. Like maybe darkness in the middle of the day, or a brilliant light at night, or the appearance of a group of angels, or heavenly trumpets, or something miraculous like that. But based on what Jesus has just said to them, they believed that the next time the unbelieving Jews that Jesus had just had a shouting match with in the temple, the next time that they would see him would be when he had a crown on his head, and they would be bowing at his feet and kissing the ring. That's what they expected. And that they would be constrained to declare, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." They're persuaded that that is not far off. They had in mind no second coming. This is going to happen now, they're thinking. They saw his coming just like those Old Testament prophets. And they compressed it all into one. And the word coming is interesting. It's the word parousia, which basically means of presence and arrival. Their question might be paraphrased, what is going to be the sign of you revealing yourself in your full permanent presence as Messiah and King? They're not using parousia from the standpoint of a technical sense. They're going to do that later on. But they're using it here to his royal pomp and pageantry. That coming. When are we going to see you walking around with the royal robes and with the crown on your head? That's what they're asking. They're not thinking about when Jesus is returning. See, we do a disservice of having read all of the Bible, and when we see that, and we see, what is the time of your coming? And immediately in our minds, we're thinking second coming. But that's not what they're asking. They're talking about the coming of the kingdom, the coming of you dressed up as the king, the coming of you to take on the throne. What about the end? It's a word that translates and refers to completion, the culmination of events. They believed that everything was going to end. This was it. I mean, Messiah's going to come, everything's going to be peace and safety, and then that's going to be the end. As in, that's all, folks, the end. And Jesus uses the phrase, the end of the age, to represent different things. Jesus says, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." We'll talk about that some more. But in essence, it would be like Jesus saying to the disciples, "You say the end of the age. I do not think it means what you think it means." Okay, for those of you that get my warped sense of humor. Okay? Never see that movie again the same way, will you? So their question about the ultimate end of the age isn't simply the end of an era or the end of a period of time, but the final end of the system of darkness and sin that they expected to be right around the corner. And it's also a question of about a new beginning, a new eternity, light and righteousness and truth and justice, the ungodly being forever damned, the godly being forever blessed. When is this going to happen? How soon is it going to be? What is the sign? What is the sign? Yes. They thought they had it from simply being Jews. Yeah, they thought they had it from simply being Jews. The majority of Jews thought that. We're going to stop there. We're going to talk about the signs of Jesus coming in 2 weeks. Next week, of course, we'll have our missionary panel, and that'll be great. And yeah, it's going to be a wonderful time. I'm so looking forward to it. I trust you are also. But over the next 2 weeks, as you have time in your quiet time, read the context here. Start Matthew 21, read all the way through 26, and you'll get the context of what it is. And think with the mindset of these disciples as you're reading through. Don't think about, 21st century Christian, you and me looking back at it. Think about reading it from their perspective so that we can kind of feel what they were feeling as it was all unfolding. Okay? All right. See you next week.